It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And as always, some smart talk radio is in your future in this segment. Extremely pleased to have with us Professor George Yin. He is the Edwin S. Cohen Distinguished Professor of Law and Taxation at the University of Virginia. He was also a former Chief of Staff of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. Quite a bit of qualification there. He also served in his past as tax counsel for the majority staff of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee from 83 to 85. Actually was hired by then Chair Kansas Senator Bob Dole. So it should be a very, very interesting conversation indeed. I know he has some strong opinions with a lot to back it up regarding America's tax situation, and specifically we'll also talk a little bit about the president's ability, desire, and or who knows what about releasing his tax returns. So it should be a good conversation indeed. Professor Yin, how are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here. Let's do this a little bit. Let's give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more setup for you. Tell us how the path that took George Yin not only to Washington, but why law and taxation of special interest to you.
Oh, gosh. Well, my interest developed in law school. I had no predilection before law school that I'd have any interest in there at all. I took an introductory course in tax in my second year of law school just because essentially everyone else in the school was doing the same thing. And I fell in love with the subject matter. And so that kind of led me on to go engage in private practice at first. And then when the opportunity came to work on Capitol Hill, to work for Senator Dole and some of the other members of the Finance Committee, that was just a great opportunity. And then that actually changed the direction of my professional career. And so once I was on Capitol Hill, I realized how interesting it would be to be able to write and research areas of my choosing rather than to simply work on client matters. And so I did get into academia after that experience, and I've been in academia ever since.
Well, a month ago in the Washington Post, you wrote an article called "Congress Has the Power to Obtain and Release Trump's Tax Returns." Without yelling and screaming and without tweeting, I would like to ask you, in the calmness of this interview today, much has been talked about asking presidents historically to release tax and other financial information, and currently that certainly is the case with President Trump right now. Back and forth, released the statements or released taxes or not. Some partial tax returns, as you know, have been released. But frankly, based on your research anyway, and history, presidential tax returns and financial information being made public is not terribly a precedent. There's quite a bit of precedent for it, is there not?
Yeah, absolutely. So a starting point is, for the last 40 years, presidents of members of both parties have voluntarily disclosed their tax information. Some of the disclosures are more extensive than others. Some just disclose the current and last couple of years of returns. Some have gone back many years of information. But every president has made an extensive disclosure, again, both Republicans and Democrats. So clearly, President Trump, by refusing to disclose anything voluntarily, is breaking from that long-standing tradition. I think the tradition has a good, sound policy basis to it. I think it developed because of the public interest in the information and the public wanted to receive assurance that there would be no conflicts of interest, that tax legislation being proposed by the new administration would not in some way, improperly benefit the president disproportionately, or if it does, at least the public would want to know about that. And the president is also now the new taxpayer in chief, and particularly at this time, we're rolling around to another tax day fairly soon, and many Americans are right now struggling to complete their returns, and some of them are going to have to pay some additional taxes. And I think the American people have gotten to the point where they want to know that their president is paying his fair share. And part of that is by disclosing your returns and allowing people to examine them to make sure that everything seems fair and appropriate. So there are a lot of really good policy reasons to do this, and of course the President Trump has now deviated from that and refused to follow the same approach.
Okay, now in defense of President Trump, you said it is a tradition. It is not, in fact, required by law. So he is allowed to do that, and therefore he takes whatever the fallout is from that. In what situations, or are there specific situations where Congress, as you said, has the power to specifically, obtain and release any president's tax return?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that power was developed, was first created in 1924, so it's almost 100 years ago. It is not limited to the president, so it would apply to anyone's tax information, yours, mine, any of your listeners, as well as the president's. And essentially what it does is it allows Congress to first get the information and review it in executive session, essentially out of the public eye, to carry out an investigation or whatever the purpose of it is. And then it also gives Congress the ability, the tax committee specifically, the ability to disclose to the public any of the findings that it believes is important for the public to know. The tax committees can do this without obtaining the consent of the taxpayer. So if we're talking about the president's tax information, there would be no need to obtain President Trump's agreement to do this. The committees can simply act on their own. And so this has been in the law for about 100 years. It's not a very well-known law, and therefore, when the issue has now repeatedly come up in the early part of the year, I wrote the op-ed essentially to just inform the public as well as members of Congress, or to remind members of Congress that this law is in there and that they, in fact, can exercise it if they so wish.
So how many times, again, historically, I do know of one time, I believe President Nixon in the early 70s, possibly writing off a donation, maybe for donating some papers, maybe to the National Archives. Is that proper on my part?
Yes, very good. You're absolutely right. So there was an incident in the before or the last years of President Nixon's term when there was a controversy about his personal taxes, and it did involve his claiming of a deduction, a fairly sizable deduction, for donating his papers to the National Archives. And there were issues raised about that, and essentially the upshot it was that Congress then used this law that I'm describing to obtain the tax information of President Nixon and ultimately to release to the public an extensive report, indicating what were the findings of the investigative committee as to Mr. Nixon's taxes. And the report did conclude that the president owed almost $500,000 of additional tax. It wasn't only that issue, but it was principally the issue that you mentioned, the charitable contribution deduction. So the law has been used on occasion. It hasn't been used very often. In recent times, not very often. It was used in 2014 relating to an investigation that the Ways and Means Committee was carrying out of some of the activities that the IRS was doing, and the Ways and Means Committee wanted to make a release of some information. The release did include taxpayer information, confidential information, and so the Ways and Means Committee then exercised the authority to do so under the law. So it has been used, including used recently, but it hasn't been used very often. In the early years, it was used, I think, more often. It's a little bit hard to tell because when you go back some years, it's hard to track exactly what was going on in each year. But in any event, I would say in the last 50 years, not used very often at all.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. And as always, Smart Talk Radio engaged indeed here, rolling along with Professor George K. Yin. He is a professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia. He is also a former chief of staff of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. Professor Yin, now that you've separated yourself a little bit from the Beltway and you're teaching now and you look back, does the tax code and does Congress and do all of us, do we think about taxes and what they represent and what they should represent in the right way? Or in your opinion, are there any fundamental flaws that need to be fixed? And I'm not talking about specific tax laws, but I'm just talking about in general, taxation code in general.
Well, I think that most people understand that whatever form of government, whatever size of government they would prefer. Some people would like a larger government that does more things. Some people would like a smaller government that does fewer things. But whatever size people would prefer, most people, I think, understand that there is a need for some amount of government. There are some national needs that we all benefit from, national defense being the most obvious, but there are a number of other things as well. And so if we do start from that assumption, then there has to be some financing for whatever the government is, and that necessarily then generally leads to taxes. So I think most people understand the reason why we have taxes. Then, of course, you get into some trickier questions, which is, well, should we apply the taxes across the board to everyone equally, or should we disproportionately burden higher income people rather than lower income people? What is the form of the tax? Should it be in the nature of, say, a sales tax, the way many states have, or should it be an income tax? So there are a lot of subsidiary questions that people can debate about and have debated about for a long time, and certainly reasonable people can differ on a lot of those questions. But I think the fundamental notion of having some taxes to pay for some level of government is, I think, pretty well understood by the American public, and I don't think there's really much disagreement on that at all.
As we approach April the 15th here, just in general terms, make the case for and against a flat rate tax. And you don't have to go too deep here, but just in general, what's the case for it? What's the case against it?
Sure. I think one of the main arguments in favor of it is that it would achieve a degree of simplification of the law. The reason I say that is often misunderstood, I think, by the general public. The actual rate is not that complicated a factor. That is, the difficulty in the law is typically figuring out how much income you have, and that can be very involved depending upon a person's circumstances. But once you figure that out, applying a particular rate is really just an arithmetical step, and oftentimes you can look it up in a table. So that's not complicated as such. But what does complicate the law by having multiple different levels of rates is it creates a number of incentives, if you will, for people to now start playing games a little bit by trying to get their income into a lower bracket person's hands as opposed to a higher bracket person's hands, or it could be a business and so forth. So there are a variety of techniques. And those techniques in turn then create a number of complications that essentially burden everybody who has to comply with the law. So I would say one of the main arguments in favor of a flat rate is that to some extent, a number of those games are now going to be removed. There's no advantage to shifting income around among different people or different businesses and so forth, and so then the complication can be reduced. Now, that actually is not completely true, because even under the biggest flat tax proposal I've ever seen, there's always a zero rate taxpayer, that is someone whose income is so low that they don't have to pay any tax at all. So there's by definition at least two rates then. There's whatever the flat rate is, and then there's zero. And therefore there is still some incentive to shift money around. But again, it is nearly as much as it would be under the current system. I would say the main argument against it is probably the idea that as one's income goes up, there's a kind of a reduced utility of additional money. And so the basic thinking is that, well, then, as your income goes up, it is appropriate and fair and efficient to gradually increase the amount of tax that is collected as a percentage of your income rather than for a lower income person. And that's the basic case for a progressive tax system, which is what essentially we've had since the beginning of the modern income tax, some degree of progression, sometimes more progressive, sometimes less progressive, but we've always had a degree of progression in our income tax system.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, talking this segment to George K. Yin, professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia and former chief of staff of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, and early in the career was hired by Bob Dole to serve in a tax advisory function, 83 to 85, I believe. Professor Yin, back to President Trump and his tax returns. Do you see him releasing them in the near future? And we'll say the near future is between now and the end of the year. And if you don't, do you see any reason or a scenario where Congress would force that to happen?
I think, based on, a somewhat cloudy crystal ball, I would say that I am cautiously optimistic that before the end of this calendar year, there will be some action on this issue. Now, whether the action would be a voluntary disclosure on the part of the president or a disclosure made in accordance with the authority I described in my op-ed, I'm not sure. I would think the more likely scenario is that the congressional tax committees would have to take the action that I've described. And I can envision that happening for a couple of reasons. One is, I think, certainly as more and more information comes out about potential conflicts of interest, particularly with that the president may have, particularly with foreign countries such as Russia and so forth, the natural question, I think, in people's minds has been, well, what is it about Russia that is so... why has the president, from almost the beginning of his campaign, kind of expressed such sympathetic views with respect to Mr. Putin and with respect to Russia? And, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know if anyone else knows the answer to that other than maybe the president himself. But at least one possibility is there's some kind of financial connection. And if that becomes serious enough, an issue, the tax returns would certainly be a potential source of information to expose that or not. So I could imagine a congressional committee getting into this issue and coming up against some dead ends, saying, gee, we need to look at the tax returns to see if we can figure some of this out. So that would be one possibility. The other possibility, I would say, is simply that right now the congressional Republicans in general are understandably, very supportive of the new president. They have an agenda, a policy agenda that they would like to accomplish, and they don't want to undermine the president's ability to carry that out. As the year goes on, it may be that things start to change. Some members in Congress may begin to realize that maybe their policy goals are not likely to be achieved or not likely to be achieved as successfully under the leadership of the current president. And if a few of those members begin to perceive that, I could imagine that some of them begin to say, well, why am I blocking the public's right to know on an issue as fundamental as this, where there's really a lot of good public policy reasons to expose this information, which, again, has been voluntarily provided by all presidents in the last 40 years. So I could imagine a handful of Republicans starting to think that way on some of these issues. Right now, really, you don't need a majority of Republicans. You just really need a handful in either the Senate or the House to take that view, and they could then go ahead and act.
Well, as we start to wind down here, again, you were the former chief of staff of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, a heavyweight position for sure. You enjoying academia, or would you like to be back inside the Beltway again?
No, I like where I am very much. I mean, I will say I had a wonderful time working on Capitol Hill, and I believe very much in public service, and I think people who have the opportunity and have the interest and have the ability, they should certainly serve their country if that opportunity were to arise. But it is a time when your time is not your own. Your entire agenda has been taken over by others, and one advantage, obviously, of teaching is that you gradually reclaim some portion of your agenda, and so I very much enjoy what I'm doing right now.
What about? Do you have any prognostication on the Cavaliers' basketball fortunes in the future?
Oh gosh, you really hit me in a weak spot there. Although I do notice that the Jayhawks they suffered their kind of a disappointment too.
Yes.
So I'm not at all gloating about that. I like the Jayhawks, but I do like the Cavaliers better, and they suffered a pretty bad loss. Yeah,
it was a tough one. Well, again, we have been talking to Professor George Yin, again, the Edwin S. Cohen Distinguished Professor of Law and Taxation, the University of Virginia, and he was also former Chief of Staff of the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. Interesting conversations indeed about taxation and also about your president. Professor Yin, how can people find out a little bit more about some of the writings and the work that you do? Website, address, anything like that before we close out here?
Sure. Well, there is a website, and I have a web page at my law school. So it would be just the University of Virginia, or if they just Google my name, George Yin, Y-I-N, they'll pick it up. And that website for me does list my various writings and so forth.
Well, we certainly appreciate your insights and the research that you've done and the work that you do. And at some point in the future, undoubtedly would like to have you back on again to talk a little bit more about this subject and others. And again, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Take care.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.